Okay, so the simplest way to think about monopolies about unions, is to think of them as sort of having a monopoly on labor. And so here, the union sets the price of labor and the employer responds to the given price by adjusting employment to maximize profits given the new wage rate. Okay? And so for simplicity, imagine that the workers are all paid a certain number of dollars, right? Or convert their benefits packages to their monetary equivalent and add that to their salary. So all we're thinking about, just for simplicity, are the dollars that are employees being paid in dollars, right? This is not meant to oversimplify. It's just to make the analysis easier, okay? And so here, unions recognize that charging higher wages will result in fewer people being hired, just like charging a higher price for apples will result in people buying fewer apples. Okay, so unions understand that. Okay? At the same time, however, they recognize that without union support, wages will be lower than they would be with union support. And so there's a trade-off. Higher wages and lower employment, or lower wages and higher employment. Okay? So labor unions understand, this sort of trade-off here. Okay? Now it could easily be the case that unions are okay with making this trade-off, to an extent, right? So for example, if they could double everyone's wages and only cost one person their job, they'll likely say that this sacrifice is, quote unquote, worth it, right? However, they likely won't try to get everybody an additional penny per hour if it means that 10,000 people will lose their jobs. And so what unions end up doing in this model is raising the wages by some amount, but perhaps not by an absurd amount. And so this way, the workers are making more money and only a few of them lose their jobs as a result. Okay? Now, we should also note that I'm not saying that people will be laid off because of the union, right? So that's not the claim I'm making. At some level, I'm making the same claim as French political philosopher Frédéric Bastiat in his article on the seen and the unseen. And so what I'm saying here, and what economists who model unions this way are saying here, is that there is no difference between someone who was working and gets fired because of the higher wages, right? And someone who wasn't working and never ends up getting hired because of the higher wages, right? There's no difference between the two except for the fact that we can see someone get fired, but we might not see someone who never got hired in the first place. Okay, so think of it this way, right? Let's say that we raised the minimum wage for McDonald's workers in Big Rapids to $20 per hour, okay? It would be very easy to count the number of people that would lose. Let's go even more absurd. Let's say we raise it to $10,000 per hour, okay? So it'd be very easy to count the number of people who are currently working at McDonald's but then get fired. We could count those people. Those would be the seen people. But what would be difficult to count would be all the people that would have worked at McDonald's if the minimum wage weren't set at $10,000 per hour, right? Because presumably, 2 years from now or whatever, some of the workers at McDonald's will graduate from Ferris and move away, and they'll be replaced by new workers, right? Well, now those new workers are never going to be hired by McDonald's in the first place, but they're still not getting their job, and so that would be sort of an unseen problem, right? And so what we're saying here is that it might be the case that that we don't see anyone lose their job because of the higher minimum wage, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there who don't get hired because of the new raise in wages, okay? And so that's what we're saying. Economically, there's no difference between the seen and the unseen, right? It's just one of them is visible and we can easily count and know that they were there. The other one we can't really count, okay? Now, an interesting implication of this model, of the monopoly union model, right, is sort of that we get to an inefficient outcome. And let's go through sort of what I'm talking about here. And so what we've got is a labor demand curve, right? So we're going to draw a simple downward sloping one, right? Just like we've drawn everywhere else in this class, okay? And unions recognize this, union leaders and the bargainers all represent this. And what we also can note is that there are sort of what we could call isoprofit curves, which if you've been reading the book, you've probably seen at one point or another. And I'm drawing them terribly. That's my fault. Let's see if I can draw them better. There we go. That's better. Okay. And so what we have here are what we call isoprofits. Okay. And what we're saying is, let's call this, I0, I1, I2. By the way, if you have the book, I'm stealing this directly from page 460. Where is it? 462. Okay. And so what we've got here is we're basically saying these isoprofit curves represent, just like in difference curves. If you remember in difference curves, they represent points in the wage quantity space that yield the same amount of profit for the firm. Okay? And so at some level, you can think of them as a firm's indifference curve. Okay? And the further down this way you are, the less you're paying workers and the more you're making or more you're working, right, the higher your profits. So we could say this one, the book says, uses the examples of 200,000. This one's 150,000. And this one's 100,000. Right, dollars. Okay? And so what we're saying is that what happens is when the labor union sort of imposes a wage on the employer, they say this is the wage that you're going to select. Let's make this a 0. Right? What the firm does is it then seeks to maximize its profits subject to that wage. Okay? And so what we have, right, is a point where, let's say the labor union says, you're going to pay W-2. Well, then the employer knows that the maximum profit they can earn is 100,000, right? And they come down here and they hire, this many workers, right? Or if the labor union were to say, you can hire W1, right? Well, this will be the maximum profit that they can pay or earn at wage 1, okay? And so what we have here is the labor union selects the wage, the firm then makes employment decisions, okay? And so this is sort of the monopoly union model. Again, the labor union selects the wage, right? Hopefully taking into account these ideas here, right? Turns out these are important, okay? They take into account those considerations, they make the judgment about what sort of trade-offs they're willing to make in terms of wages for their employees and the number of employees that will not be hired either because they were fired or they just simply won't be hired at all to begin with, right? And then the business or the firm selects the output, okay? So this is sort of the way that everyone has modeled labor unions up until approximately the late 90s, early 2000s. Okay, the next model we're going to talk about is a little bit more convoluted, but more closely presents sort of what we're talking about. And if I remember correctly, I drew. Nope, I didn't include it. Never mind. So if you want to see this exact picture, check out page 462 of your textbook, and you'll see it there.